You know the scene. Alice follows a white rabbit, tumbles down a hole, and wakes up in a world that makes no sense. For 160 years, readers and scholars have called it whimsy, fantasy, a fever dream of pure imagination. But hidden inside the most famous children's book ever written is something historians have only recently begun to fully assemble. A confession, a code, a map of specific, documented crises unfolding inside one of the world's most powerful institutions. And the man who wrote it wasn't just encoding abstract social commentary. He was encoding crimes, rivalries, and institutional failures that he watched destroy real people from inside the walls of Oxford University. Once you trace the real identities behind every major character in Wonderland, once you see the specific historical events Carroll was disguising as nonsense, the book stops being a fairy tale entirely. It becomes a witness statement, and witnesses, as Carroll himself understood, had to be very careful about speaking plainly. Let's begin. The character of Alice herself starts the unraveling. Tenniel's iconic illustrations, the blonde girl in a blue dress, are so embedded in popular consciousness that almost no one thinks to ask a simple question. Why is Alice blonde? The real Alice Little, whose photographs Carroll took obsessively and preserved in his personal albums, had a dark bowl cut. Tenniel's blonde Alice was not the real Alice at all. She was a composite, a deliberate disguise. Scholars examining the Tenniel-Carroll correspondence preserved at Princeton University found that Carroll gave Tenniel unusually specific instructions about Alice's appearance, while remaining deliberately vague about every other character's physical detail. He wanted the girl at the center of his story to be unrecognizable, as the specific child she was based upon. That act of deliberate physical obscuring is the first layer of what Wonderland actually was. Not a gift to a child, but a document that required plausible deniability built into its very illustrations. To understand why Carroll needed that deniability, you have to understand what Christ Church, Oxford, actually was in 1862. Not a serene academic institution. A political battlefield. Henry Liddell, Alice's father, had recently been installed as Dean of Christ Church in a move that split the college into bitter, lasting factions. Liddell was a government-backed reformer, despised by the conservative old guard of the college, of whom Carroll was one of the most vocal and prolific. The conflict between Liddell's reforming agenda and the ancient college's resistance was playing out in faculty meetings, anonymous pamphlets, and venomous letters circulating through Oxford's tight academic community. Carroll, writing fiction under the pseudonym Lewis Carroll, while publishing political attacks under his real name Charles Dodgson, had already gone after Liddell's proposed architectural changes to Christ Church in a pamphlet called The New Belfry of Christ Church, describing the dean's beloved bell tower addition as resembling a wooden box of the sort in which cheese is preserved. He was not a peripheral figure dreaming up pleasant stories. He was a frontline combatant in a vicious institutional war, and Alice Liddell was the daughter of his most powerful enemy. That is the relationship inside which Wonderland was born. Picture Christ Church's Great Quadrangle in the summer of 1862. The same summer, Carroll rowed the Liddell girls down the Thames and invented his story aloud. The new belfry stood as an open wound on the ancient architecture, its plain wooden top visible from the dining hall windows, where Carroll ate in daily proximity to the man who had authorized its construction. The senior common room hummed with faction politics. Carroll's own lectureship in mathematics was under structural threat from the reforms Liddell and his allies were driving through the university. He was, in the language of his own eventual creation, a man in a world that made no sense, where the rules kept changing and the authority figures delivered verdicts with no reference to evidence or reason. The character of the Queen of Hearts makes immediate sense once you have this context, but the real target goes deeper than most people realize. Scholars focusing on the Queen have almost universally pointed toward general monarchical tyranny, but Carroll scholars, particularly Anne Clark Amore in her biography, held at the Bodleian Library, identified something more specific. The Queen's perpetual demand for execution, regardless of guilt or evidence, was Carroll's precise depiction of how Oxford's disciplinary committees functioned during the Reform era. Minutes from Christchurch's disciplinary proceedings between 1860 and 1865, preserved in the college archive and cited by Oxford historian V.H. Green, document multiple cases in which junior academics saw their careers formally ended on strength of hearsay from senior fellows aligned with the new Reform faction. Off with their heads was not abstract political satire. It was a direct transcription of what Carroll watched happening to his colleagues in rooms he sat in, conducted by men he ate dinner with every evening. But the character that carries the most historically documented specificity isn't the Queen of Hearts. It's the Mad Hatter. Carroll's letters, many held at the British Library, refer repeatedly to a real Oxford figure named Theophilus Carter, an eccentric furniture dealer invariably seen wearing a top hat who is known across Oxford for his argumentative, incoherent personality. However, the Carter explanation is only the surface. What historians of Victorian occupational medicine have documented with disturbing precision is that the phrase "mad as a hatter" described a thoroughly understood, thoroughly ignored epidemic of mercury poisoning destroying England's hat industry workforce in real time. The Lancet published reports on hatter's shakes as early as 1829. French physician Dr. Adolphe Delpech published formal confirmation of the mercury nervous system connection in 1865, the same year Alice in Wonderland appeared in print. By Carroll's decade, it was common medical knowledge that felt hat workers were being neurologically destroyed by mercury nitrate vapors. The symptoms: uncontrollable trembling, deteriorating speech, personality disintegration, and hallucinations, were so culturally embedded that every social class in England used the expression without needing to explain it. Consider the testimony of a felt worker named George Sims, preserved in the Parliamentary Select Committee report on factory conditions published in 1864. Sims had worked for 14 years in a Stockport hat factory. He told the committee that by his 12th year, he could no longer hold his tea mug without spilling it. His handwritten signature, submitted as evidence in the report, shows a name that begins in a controlled hand and deteriorates into illegible shaking within 3 letters. The committee noted his testimony carefully, thanked him formally, and produced a report recommending further study. The use of mercury in hat making was not banned in Britain until 1941, and then only because the military needed mercury for weapons detonators. Carroll chose to build one of his most beloved characters entirely around this disease. The Mad Hatter's eternal frozen tea party, the inability to move forward to a clean cup, the repetitive circular questions that lead nowhere. These are the documented symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning rendered as absurdist comedy, because comedy was the only form in which it could survive being printed. Carroll's genius was understanding that tragedy disguised as nonsense reaches more minds than tragedy stated plainly. Now we arrive at the historical layer in Wonderland that has been most carefully buried by subsequent adaptation, and it requires understanding what Oxford University was actually debating at an institutional level in Carroll's decade. Carroll was a committed conservative mathematician in the middle of one of the most violent intellectual upheavals in the history of mathematics itself. For centuries, Euclidean geometry, the mathematics of visible, stable, physically real space, had been the foundation of all mathematical thought. In the 1860s, non-Euclidean geometry, symbolic algebra, and abstract mathematical logic were dismantling Euclidean certainty in papers circulating through every major university in Europe. Carroll considered these new systems not merely wrong, but existentially dangerous. He published a formal opposition titled Euclid and His Modern Rivals in 1879, but 15 years before that book appeared, he was encoding his opposition directly into Wonderland's narrative logic. The scene of Alice growing and shrinking is not a drug metaphor, and it is not pure fantasy. In a non-Euclidean geometric space, the reliable proportional relationships of Euclidean geometry simply do not hold. Objects change size relative to each other based on the frame of reference rather than any stable absolute measurement. Carroll's Alice, whose entire crisis is her inability to maintain stable size and thus stable identity, dramatizes precisely what he believed non-Euclidean mathematics was doing to the foundations of rational thought. The moment she consumes something and her proportions collapse, she loses certainty about who she is. In Carroll's mathematical philosophy, that was not a metaphor. It was a clinical prediction. Abandon stable Euclidean axioms and you abandon your grip on physical reality entirely. Alice's terrified question, "Who in the world am I?" was Carroll's question about the future of human rationality in a post-Euclidean mathematical world. The scene of Alice's multiplication tables producing wrong answers, 4 times 5 is 12, 4 times 6 is 13, which Carroll's own correspondence confirms he constructed deliberately and precisely, is not random nonsense. Oxford mathematics historian Robin Wilson, in his published studies of Carroll's mathematical work, demonstrated that these calculations are arithmetically correct in specific non-standard number bases. Carroll constructed them with precise mathematical knowledge. He wrote a scene in which a child applying her reliable, memorized mathematics discovers that in a logically consistent but differently axiomed system, her trustworthy knowledge produces entirely different answers. The existential breakdown this produces in Alice was Carroll's precise indictment of the new mathematics. Change the foundational axioms, and the knowledge of every child who ever memorized a multiplication table becomes meaningless. The education system was building identities on foundations Carroll believed were being dissolved, and Alice's collapse was his prediction of what would happen when those children grew up and discovered the ground had moved beneath them. But Carroll's most devastating encoding, the one that has been most thoroughly documented and most systematically overlooked by popular adaptation, concerns the Cheshire Cat, and it cannot be understood without the specific theological earthquake that was fracturing England's educated class in Carroll's decade. Darwin's On the Origin of Species had been published in 1859, 3 years before Carroll invented Alice's story on that river. The famous Oxford debate between Thomas Huxley, defending Darwin, and Bishop Wilberforce, defending creation, had taken place in June 1860 in the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, a building Carroll could see from his college rooms. The personal testimonies of men who attended that debate, recorded in letters archived at the Bodleian, describe an event that felt less like an academic exchange and more like a controlled demolition. When Huxley finished, several audience members reportedly required assistance leaving the room. One woman fainted. Something had been publicly broken that could not be publicly repaired. The Cheshire Cat disappears gradually, leaving nothing behind but its smile. Read against the specific Oxford theological crisis of the 1860s. This is the most precisely engineered image in the entire book. The body of religious certainty, the structured, verifiable, institutionally embedded presence of God in the intellectual world, was disappearing from educated English life. What remained, hanging in the air after the body had dissolved, was the smile, the pleasant cultural residue of Christian civilization, its moral manners, its assumption of inherent order, its charitable institutions, its comfortable social rituals, persisting in empty air long after the theological substance that had generated them had gone. Carroll didn't give the cat a dramatic exit. He gave it the only exit available to something that had organized a civilization. It disappeared so gradually that for a moment you weren't sure it was really gone. And then there was only the smile, and then even that was uncertain. That is not a whimsical observation. It is one of the most forensically accurate descriptions of the Victorian crisis of faith ever put into English prose, encoded into a children's story precisely because an Oxford mathematics lecturer could not publish it in any other form without professional destruction. The most damaging piece of physical evidence connecting Wonderland to Carroll's specific institutional circumstances was not discovered until 1996. A researcher named Caroline Leach, examining the Dodgson family archive, found a single summary memorandum written in a family member's hand describing the contents of the deleted diary pages from June 1863, the pages Carroll's family had cut out and burned. The memorandum, examined and authenticated by Carroll scholars, indicates that the deleted entry described Carroll being told by Mrs. Liddell, Alice's mother, to end all contact with the family. The reason given in the memorandum is ambiguous, and scholars dispute its precise meaning, but one documented interpretation, supported by Leach's research and published by her in The Real Lewis Carroll, is that Mrs. Liddell believed Carroll had expressed romantic interest not in Alice, but in the family's governess, Miss Prickett, and possibly in Alice's older sister, Lorena. The complexity of what was actually destroyed in those pages remains unresolved, but the act of destroying it confirms beyond reasonable doubt that Carroll's relationship with the Liddell family contained something that his own relatives, reading it after his death, judged too dangerous to survive in writing. In 1928, Alice Liddell Hargreaves, then in her late 70s and facing serious financial difficulty following her husband's death, sold Carroll's original handwritten manuscript of Alice's Adventures Underground, the private version he had given her as a personal gift, at Sotheby's in London for £15,400, needed to cover inheritance death duties. The manuscript traveled to America. Alice herself gave interviews late in her life that were collected and preserved, and in several of them she said the same thing in different ways. She had never fully understood, she said, what the story was really about. Carroll had always seemed to be speaking about something she was too young to see. He had seemed to be speaking, she said, slightly past her, toward something she couldn't quite reach. She was right. Carroll was speaking past her. The real audience was his Oxford colleagues, the men who would recognize the Queen of Hearts' voice in the disciplinary committee chambers they both sat in, who would know the Hatter's real name and real disease, who would feel in their own mathematical bones what a world without Euclidean certainty actually meant, who would stand inside the Cheshire Cat's dissolving smile every Sunday morning in Christchurch Cathedral, wondering what they actually believed. The child was the disguise. The nonsense was the camouflage. The magic trick at the center of Wonderland is that it worked so completely that 160 years later, most of the world still sees the disguise and calls it whimsy. Carroll didn't write a children's book. He wrote a classified record of the intellectual, institutional, and theological destruction of Victorian England. And he hid it in plain sight inside the story of a confused little girl, because a confused little girl was the only narrator the Victorian world would let speak that kind of truth out loud. The next time someone tells you Wonderland is just a delightful fantasy, remember that the man who built it was a mathematician at war, watching the foundations of his world dissolve in 3 directions simultaneously, and the only language he found powerful enough to describe it was nonsense, because that's exactly what it felt like to be Charles Dodgson in Oxford in 1862, and he needed the world to feel it too.